typical Frenchman, throws out 25 kilos of electronic waste every year. I know we have seen a remarkable and important increase in recycling, but just to stay with France, if you just look at the mountain of waste created by French people, it's 4 times as much now as it was in 1970. Why and how have we become so immersed in stuff? There are 2 ways of thinking about it which have been especially popular. And the first is what Galbraith called the affluent society. He argued that the United States, after the Second World War, became a new kind of society, unseen before in history, an affluent society. And he saw those characteristics as a fairly sudden shift from cultures that were organized around needs to those that had wants, with people who now became obsessed with their private material satisfaction and pretty indifferent to issues of public welfare. To fund all those material objects, they took out increasing amounts of credit and thus became indebted. And you had public squalor and environmental pollution as a consequence of more and more people desiring Cadillacs and others to drive in their own car around town. A second and often related model to think about the rise of consumption has been what Thorstein Veblen, a famous social scientist in late 19th century America, called conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption assumes that the rich are using material possessions to show off their wealth and to keep the hoi polloi at a distance. But in course, the middle classes are trying to imitate the very rich, and they also want a Cadillac. And in the process, cars get bigger and bigger and bigger. For our own times, connected to this idea of conspicuous consumption has been the idea that inequality or rising inequality will fuel what some people call luxury fever. Right? As people become more separated by wealth, the poorer groups want to try harder and harder to keep up. It means bigger credit card bills. Well, let's zoom in Germany, Frankfurt in 1952, which had been heavily bombed during the Second World War. Reconstruction had barely started. The Marshall Plan, which aided European recovery, had the good idea that they wanted a photo exhibition and a photo competition to encourage Germans to think about the Nazi past, but also to capture what they really wanted in the future. And so the Marshall Plan decided they wanted photo entries to be on themes like new homes, no more poverty, no more war. And one of the lucky winners was a 19-year-old Frankfurt girl, Heidi Simon, who had been born in the year Hitler came to power in 1933. She won a Vespa moped and a cash prize. And Heidi said, well, she's quite grateful for the prize, but without wanting to sound impertinent, wouldn't it be possible to have a Lambretta moped rather than the Vespa? The Lambretta was so much more fashionable, and she had longed for a Lambretta for the whole last year. Ministry officials scratched their heads and ultimately said no, and sent her the Vespa. So here we are in a place where people have very, very basic worries. A roof over their head, a decent square meal, and a 19-year-old says, I want a fashionable moped. Well, it suggests that the Galbraith model, that before affluence, people just try to satisfy their basic physical needs, and you have to be rich in the first place to think about material possessions, is wrong. It's not that we have a sequential break. People had material desires, and consumption had been expanding for quite some time. One big moment in which consumption gathers speed is in the 16th and 17th century. That's partly because trade is expanding, both in late Ming China, but also in Renaissance Italy. And you have a new culture of sociability where material possessions and goods, like this wonderful bottle from Ying Deshen in China from the late 16th century, or teapots and coffee cups encouraged people to share leisure time by using goods. Now, this was a global moment, not just a Western sudden spurt to modernity, but nonetheless, by the 17th and 18th century, it's discernible that Holland and Britain are racing ahead. They're not just having more trade, they're developing an entirely new consumer culture unseen before. What are the elements of that? One is Atlantic trade and the rise of European empires. Without empires, it's inconceivable that you would have had the slave trade to move forcibly people from Africa to the Caribbean and Brazil to grow there exotic plants and products which then would be shipped back to Europe. A second big factor is high wages. Britain in particular was distinguished by having a high wage economy after the Black Death wiped out a large part of the population. And high wages meant more disposable income. You then have a much more urbanized setting in Britain and Holland. So, in 1500, roughly 1 in 30 people lived in towns and cities in Britain. By 1800, it's every 4th person. And living in cities means more shops, more commercial spaces, and you have fewer barriers lying in the way of goods trying to reach new customers and markets. Whereas on the continent in Germany, you had to unpack your box of stuff every 10 or 20 miles to reach customs offices. Absolutely crucial, though, I would argue, are not these social economic factors. They're important, but what really made a shift is a new cultural orientation towards goods, where goods were recognized and embraced as enriching individuals. It's what the 19th century philosopher William James called a material self. What William James said was, yes, people have a psyche and they have a mind, but there's also something that is the material self. And that's composed of people's possessions and their hobbies and their homes. And losing any of these possessions is experienced by individuals as if their identity shrinks. In the 18th century, David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, in a beautiful essay on luxury, argued that modest luxury shouldn't be sneered at. Modest luxury is actually a good thing. It made people inquisitive and innovative, trying to create new goods. And in turn, that brought people together in things like royal societies and clubs. And that in turn made nations richer and stronger and advanced civilization in due course. By the late 19th century, you can see a whole set of dimensions in society where people are coming to terms with that new material self. You can see it in novels. You see it in the new cult of DIY and home improvement. And you even see it in religious movements. To give you just one example, the Mormons in the United States, in their newspaper, the Mormon Desert News in 1860, put it very well. They said, "The foundation of our society has been laid. Now the work of ornamentation, adornment, and more perfect development becomes a matter of judicious attention." And once you think about it in the Mormon kind of way, God has created this world for us to enjoy, and there are lots of possibilities in this world, new products to be designed and invented and appreciated. Surely, if you're a good Christian, you should enjoy those things and take care of your own person by being fashionable in your own way. By the late 19th century, we have department stores, like Selfridges and others, that consciously position themselves as a kind of commercial museum of the world, in which people can not just shop for items, but get a sense of the material richness of the world with all sorts of foreign and exotic products. Now, underneath that department store, though, is a deeper layer of material infrastructures that transform the way we consume and live today. And those are the networks of water, gas, and electricity. And these changes, these very basic, ordinary changes in material life are quite astounding. So in 1900, in New York City, the average consumption of a tenant per day of water because water systems and infrastructures had now been put in pipes, was 39 gallons a day. On the richer Upper West Side, it was 4 times as much. That's pretty much current American levels of water consumption, including gardening and so forth. As a historian, you have the opportunity to put big developments next to each other, which are normally treated in isolation. And 2 very big ones are the age of the new imperialism in the late 19th century, when Europeans took control and carved up Africa, and mass consumption. Because by the late 19th century, we don't really deal any longer just with elite consumption. Consumption is everywhere. So I asked myself, well, what's the connection between these two? Is there a connection? I mean, they happen at the same time. Something must be going on. And indeed, there are fascinating connections. One thing the anti-slavery movement and the slave trade was abolished in the British Empire in 1807. One thing that movement did was to impose a new culture of things in the British Empire. Instead of marking your power and status by having lots of slaves or retainers around you, the abolition of the slave trade said, no, you can't do that anymore. Have things instead. Show your status by having a bigger house, better furnishings, more possessions. So that's a very, very important shift from, if you want, man ownership to goods ownership. And in the early decades, the abolitionists and also the missionaries were full of optimism. So in Sierra Leone, they would report on how local people had suddenly become merchants and improved the material comforts of their home. By the late 19th century, when European empires truly expand and impose imperial power all over Africa, that optimism was gone. Now missionaries complained that converts would come to them with catalogs sent to them from London saying, oh, I want this, can you get me this hat for Christmas? Or I like this tie, but can I have it with different patterns? And in general, as British imperialists took control, they wanted to preserve their distance to their subjects. So emulation of European styles is now frowned upon. Africans should be coolies, not customers. And European powers impose all sorts of new policies to try and prevent Africans from trading and instead want them to work in mines or grow cotton for European industry. But there's also an interesting story in Europe itself, and that concerns the makeover of exotic goods. When coffee, cocoa, and other things were introduced to Europeans in the 16th, 17th century, their big value lay in them being exotic, from far and distant places, never seen before. Only connoisseurs would understand how to boil them and how to drink them appropriately. That gave them their quality. In the years around 1900, the exotic disappears. If you go through the wonderful early color advertising posters of colonial goods, what you see increasingly is things like in this image from Finland, the so-called Polar Girl, which the Paulig company introduced in the early 1920s, and real-life polar girls. There were competitions. The most beautiful would then travel up and down Finland to explain to people how to brew real Finnish coffee. Finland doesn't grow coffee, but for consumers, this was Finnish coffee. And similarly, Cadbury's, in their cocoa adverts, now starts to advertise the good old English cocoa. Tobler in Switzerland puts the Matterhorn on its chocolate bars. Well, as you know, there's no chocolate growing at 3,000 feet. The Germans introduced Rhineland coffee, and the Americans have New Orleans coffee because that's the port where coffee arrives. So these are racist societies, but instead of being sort of bang-in-your-face racism, it's a much more subtle presentation because it's now treated as European products where the value is created by Europeans and European processing. Second aspect which has fascinated me is what difference inequality makes and what difference states make to consumption. We tend to think of consumption as something that happens in the marketplace. I go, I shop, and I pay, and then that's it. But of course, there's a lot going on around shops. First, let me say a few words about inequality, because inequality has had a lot of attention for very good reasons in recent years. Here you have a diagram showing how the income share of the richest 10% in affluent societies has developed over the years. And you can see that sort of roughly from the late 70s and early 80s, the richest 10% increase their slice. That's the story that's been talked about, and people have said, well, it explains everything. I mean, that's why people now buy lots of Prada accessories. They're trying to keep up with the rich. The rich have more expensive bags. The rich have bigger yachts. So everyone else tries to also spend more, and that's why we have a crisis about consumer debit. But if we take a longer view, if we go back in time, what we see is the period before the late 70s, roughly from the Second World War onwards, sees a dramatic decline in inequality. So the years from the 40s to the 70s are the golden age of advancing equality. Societies have never been as equal as they were in the 50s and 60s. Even the super rich in America shut down their Newport mansions to try and live more like an ordinary middle-class society, without servants, without racehorses, without multiple yachts. Aren't these also the years that see the post-war boom in consumption? When people buy cars, fridges, televisions, vacuum cleaners, and all sorts of other gadgets, the era of mass consumption come true. I've just told you the orthodoxy that inequality produces more consumption. Now we have suddenly growing equality producing more consumption. Well, the reason for that is that consumption isn't just about buying luxury products. Most of you, I doubt, spend most of your income on luxury accessories. But many of you will have cars and washing machines and fridges and all that sort of stuff. And the reason why this happens is partly related to the third graph on the right. If you don't just think about equality in isolation, but then ask about what do states spend, social spending. So everything from money for children to public housing to public state pensions and social transfers is called social spending. And as you can see in this graph, we see from the 60s to roughly the 2000s a massive increase. So the OECD currently average is something like 20% of GDP is devoted to social spending. Now that translates effectively into additional money that goes into households. Not all households, and I'm aware in some countries like Greece is a good case, pensions actually don't go to the poorest, they go to the people who had decent jobs for a long time. But nonetheless, there are social transfers that mean there's more money indirectly coming in, not through your paycheck, but through things the state subsidizes. And it's very hard to think about mass consumption after the Second World War, and indeed our own society, without realizing how important the state is in lifting up poor people onto the stage of consumer society. Otherwise, they would never have reached that. How much? Well, the Nobel Prize winners Amartya Sen and Joe Stiglitz and Fitoussi have done calculations where they suggest that in places like France today, roughly 20% on average of the household income is through the state. Some of you will have seen the press coverage given to the IKEA boss, who the other week said, we've seen peak stuff, and we're moving from stuff to fluff, as some other prophets say. You know, I'm an optimist, but there's a difference between reality and fantasy. And I've not seen any data to back up this idea that we are in a process of dematerialization, to give it its proper names. Briefly, why am I skeptical? Well, the first is if you just look at the amount of stuff. You know, we tend to assume the Swedes, they're austere, they're frugal, they're not like the flashy Americans. And let's look at what they've been buying. Well, in the last 20 years, people in Stockholm have been buying 4 times as many appliances as they did in the 70s. and 3 times as much clothing. Doesn't sound like peak stuff has been reached to me. If you then ask not just about the things you have in your shopping bags, but all the materials that are needed to produce the products, each one of us in the average week would have to walk home with an additional 100 to 150 kilos in our shopping bags of the materials needed to produce the tablets, the shoes, and all the other objects that we buy. That's a lot of stuff. So what should we do? If you follow the models, the conventional wisdom, reach the conclusion that the one answer is zero growth. We just have to have zero growth, otherwise we can't do anything. I think that is very, very foolish. Zero growth is a little bit like sitting in a very, very heavy truck that's stalled. Try to move that truck when it's not moving. If you want sustainability, you need green growth. You need the truck to be moving, to steer it in a different direction. Secondly, as we've seen, the rise of consumption started well before governments defined GDP in the 1940s. So I don't see just moving to zero growth will do much good. Second option is, if you follow the conspicuous consumption model, is let's just get rid of inequality. If we're all more equal, we won't consume that much. Well, we've seen that's nonsense. One thing the story also tells us is that in the past, the desire for things and the use of things is not just given. It's not in people's DNA. It's the product of history. To get arc lights, to get water networks, these are the results of big interventions by states, by social movements, and by organized consumers. So if we want to have a chance of confronting and dealing with the big problem of sustainability, we do need to give that bigger history of consumption a closer look.